Texas, 1823. There was no law here. Not really. Just land vast, brutal, and beautiful, stretching so far west that no man had mapped its end. And into that land, one man walked with a plan so bold it nearly got him killed. His name was Stephen F. Austin, and he had inherited an impossible dream from his dead father. Moses Austin had convinced the Spanish government to let American colonists settle in Texas. Then Moses died, leaving Stephen to make it real. Stephen Austin gathered roughly 300 families, farmers, tradesmen, people desperate for a new start, and brought them into a land that did not want them there. Not because the land was empty. It wasn't. The Comanche had ruled these plains for over a century, and they were the most fearsome horse warriors on the continent. They were not going to simply step aside. Raids came fast and hard. Settlers woke up to burning homes. Horses stolen. Livestock gone. And sometimes, worst of all, people taken. Austin wrote letters begging the Mexican government for military protection. The answer came back slowly, and it was almost always the same: "We cannot help you right now." Austin was on his own. So in 1823, he did something that had no official name yet. He organized 10 men, just 10, and told them to range across the territory. To ride out ahead of danger. To protect the settlements at all costs. They weren't soldiers in any formal sense. They had no uniforms, no salary that anyone could count on, and no rulebook. What they had was grit, horses, and a working knowledge of how to survive in a place that killed men casually. These 10 men became the seat of something that would grow into one of the most legendary law enforcement bodies in American history. But in 1823, nobody called them the Texas Rangers yet. They were just men on horses doing a job no one else would do. And the job was getting worse by the year. By the early 1830s, Austin's colony had grown. Thousands of American settlers now lived in Texas under Mexican rule. The tension between the colonists and the Mexican government had been building for years, like a storm you can feel before you can see it. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. Most of Austin's settlers had come from the American South and brought enslaved people with them. They ignored the law. Mexico tightened its grip. In 1830, they banned further American immigration into Texas entirely. Austin kept trying to negotiate, kept writing letters, kept playing the careful diplomat. But the ground was shifting beneath him. Younger, angrier men were arriving, men who didn't want to negotiate with anyone. And in 1835, the whole thing finally broke open. The Texas Revolution had begun. It started with a small cannon and a flag that read, "Come and take it." The Mexicans tried to take the cannon back from the settlers in Gonzales. The settlers refused. Shots were fired. And just like that, a war had started over a 6-pound cannon that no one even knew if it still worked. In the chaos that followed, the Rangers, still barely an organized force, were formally recognized for the first time. On November 24, 1835, the Provisional Texas government officially established 3 companies of Rangers. They were to be paid $1.25 a day, which was good money then. Their job, protect the frontier while the revolution raged. But protecting the frontier while a full-scale war consumed the land wasn't patrolling. It was surviving. Within months, the Rangers would find themselves caught between a revolutionary war on one side and the unrelenting pressure of Comanche raids on the other. They were outnumbered, underfunded, and operating in a land soaked in blood. And then came the Alamo. What happened there would shake the Rangers to their core and force them to become something far deadlier than anyone had planned. Stephen F. Austin had a problem that would have broken most men. He was trying to build a civilization in the middle of a war zone. The land he'd been granted was vast, over 200,000 acres of rolling prairie and dense river bottoms. And it was home to the Karankawa, the Tonkawa, and most fearfully, the Comanche. These were not people who intended to share. Austin knew the Spanish colonial militia model would never work out here. Those soldiers were tied to forts, waiting for orders, slow and formal and useless on open ground. What he needed was something faster, harder, and meaner than anything the frontier had seen. In 1823, Austin put 10 men on horses and told them to range. Not patrol a line. Not guard a fort. Range, move, find, fight, protect. That word range was everything. These 10 men had no uniforms, no salary anyone could actually count on, and no rulebook. What they had was horses, rifles, and the kind of stubbornness that only the frontier breeds. Austin's first ranging company covered a stretch of land that would make professional soldiers weep. Think about that, 10 men for roughly 500 square miles of hostile, unmapped wilderness. The math was insane. But the idea was genius. You see, Austin wasn't trying to hold territory. He was trying to deny it, to make every raider, every threat, feel watched, feel followed, feel hunted. The first rangers moved in small groups, sometimes pairs, sometimes alone. They read tracks the way a schoolteacher reads a page. A bent blade of grass, a disturbed creek bank, an ash pile still warm, these were sentences to them. They slept on the ground, ate what they could kill, and didn't complain because there was nobody to complain to. One of the earliest named rangers was Moses Morrison. Morrison had been a soldier, a scout, a survivor of a frontier that chewed men up and spat them out. He understood that speed was armor on the open plain. If you stopped moving, you died. The Comanche already knew this, their entire culture was built around it. And that made them the most dangerous enemy Austin's rangers would ever face. Here's the thing people miss about the early Comanche threat: it wasn't random violence. It was strategy. Comanche raiders would strike fast at dawn, take horses and captives, and vanish back into the Llano Estacado before noon. The rangers had to learn to think the same way: strike fast, don't overcommit, live to ride again. The first ranging companies had no formal training. They learned by doing, which meant some of them learned too late. But the ones who survived became something new, something America had never quite produced before. Not soldiers. Not lawmen. Something in between, and something beyond both. By 1826, Austin had expanded the ranging idea, commissioning a slightly larger force. The pay was barely real: land warrants, promises, handshakes. Men signed on anyway, because the alternative was watching their neighbors' farms burn. Some of these early rangers were barely 20 years old. Some had already buried wives, children, entire families to disease and violence. They had nothing left to lose, which made them exactly the kind of men you wanted riding into the dark. The early Texas Rangers had no badge, no headquarters, no chain of command worth mentioning. What held them together was simpler and stranger than any institution. It was a shared, bone-deep understanding that if they didn't do this job, nobody would. That feeling, that weight, would define the Rangers for the next 200 years. And just when Austin thought he had the ranging system working, the ground shifted beneath his feet entirely. The Comanche had ruled the southern plains for over a century before any ranger ever set foot in Texas. They were the finest light cavalry in North America, maybe the world. A Comanche warrior could fire 12 arrows in the time it took a man to reload a single rifle. That was not a boast. That was a fact the early rangers learned the hard way. By the 1830s, Comanche raiding parties were striking deep into Anglo settlements, burning farms, taking captives, vanishing before anyone could respond. The rangers were supposed to stop them. But the men riding those early patrols were outgunned, outmanned, and completely outmatched on open ground. Here's the brutal truth: a ranger on foot against a Comanche warrior on horseback had almost no chance. Everything changed in the summer of 1840. A man named John Coffee Hayes was given command of a small company of rangers near San Antonio. He was 23 years old. People called him Jack. Hayes was quiet, almost still, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. But he had a gift for reading terrain and reading men, and he was already thinking about the problem differently than anyone before him. The Comanche won because they were faster. So Hayes decided the Rangers needed to be just as fast and twice as lethal when they finally caught up. That answer came in the form of a weapon almost nobody trusted yet. Samuel Colt's new 5-shot revolving pistol had been around since 1836, but most soldiers and militiamen had written it off as unreliable. Hayes believed in it. He armed his Rangers with the Colt Paterson revolver and drilled them until they could reload at a full gallop. Then he waited for the Comanche to come to him. In June of 1844, they did. A war party of about 70 Comanche warriors cornered Hayes and 15 of his men in the Rocky Hills near Walker Creek, northwest of San Antonio. The Comanche expected the Rangers to dismount, fire their single-shot rifles, and scramble to reload. That was the window, the desperate half-minute of fumbling with powder and ball when warriors would charge and cut them down. It did not go that way. Hayes ordered his men to hold fire, let the warriors close the distance, and then charge directly into them. The Rangers hit the war party at close range, blazing with revolvers that did not stop after one shot. The Comanche had never seen anything like it. When the smoke cleared, Hayes had lost one man. The Comanche lost more than 30. Word spread fast across the frontier, the Rangers had found their answer. But the Comanche did not quit. They adapted, they regrouped, and they kept raiding harder, further south, deeper into settled territory. Through the late 1840s, even as Texas joined the United States and the U.S. Army arrived, the raids continued. The Army built forts and planted soldiers in straight lines along the frontier. The Comanche simply rode around them. The Rangers understood something the Army did not. You could not defend a line against men who did not recognize lines. You had to pursue them into their own country, into the Llano Estacado, the Stake Plains, that brutal featureless tableland in West Texas where the sky and the earth blur together and men go mad from thirst. Very few white men had ever gone there and come back. The Rangers would go anyway. By 1850, a generation of Rangers had been built in those hills and plains, men shaped by loss, by relentless pursuit, by years of sleeping on rock and eating nothing. They were not heroes in any clean sense of the word. Some of them did things in those years that history has quietly set aside. But they did not stop. They learned to track a war party across limestone and dry creek beds. They learned to ride 3 days without water if they had to. They learned that to fight the Comanche, you had to think like the Comanche, fast, ruthless, and without mercy. That lesson would define the Rangers for the next 100 years. But the war on the plains was far from over, and the worst battle any of them had ever seen was still coming. By 1846, the Texas Rangers had already become legends in their own time. But legend doesn't stop a bullet. And in the summer of that year, the Rangers rode into a war that would demand something new from them entirely. The Mexican-American War had begun, and the United States needed fighters who could hold rough ground against a professional army. The Rangers answered. Among them was a man named Samuel Hamilton Walker, Captain Sam Walker, a ranger who had survived things that should have killed him twice over. He had been captured by Mexican forces during the Meyer expedition in 1842. Forced to draw a black bean in a lottery that decided who would be executed. He drew white. He lived. But living only made him hungrier to fight. When the Mexican-American War broke out, Walker saw his chance, and he took it with both hands. Here's where the story gets remarkable. Walker had spent years in the field with the Rangers, and he knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what was wrong with their weapons. The Colt Paterson revolver, the gun that had given the Rangers an edge at the Battle of Pedernales Creek, was impressive for its time. But it was also fragile, underpowered, and when the cylinder ran dry, reloading it in the middle of a Comanche charge was nearly impossible. Walker knew what a better gun would look like. So he went to the man who made the original. Samuel Colt was 32 years old, brilliant, and almost broke. His patent arms manufacturing company had collapsed in 1842, and Colt hadn't sold a revolver in years. Walker tracked him down in New York and sat across a table from him with a simple proposition. Make me a better gun. The two men worked together through 1846, Walker drawing on everything he had seen in actual combat, Colt bringing the engineering. What came out of those meetings was unlike anything the world had seen. The Colt Walker revolver. It weighed 4.5 pounds. It fired a .44 caliber ball with enough force to knock a man off a horse at 100 yards. It held 6 shots, without reloading. The United States Army placed an order for 1,000 of them almost immediately. It was the largest handgun order in American history up to that point. Colt used the money to reopen his factory, and the American firearms industry was never quite the same again. Walker himself carried his new revolver into battle in Mexico. He led charges at Huamantla, in the state of Tlaxcala, in October of 1847. His men rode hard into the city under fire. And then, in the narrow streets of Huamantla, at 30 years old, Sam Walker was shot from his horse and killed. He never made it home to Texas. But what he left behind was permanent. The gun he helped design would become the template for the modern revolver. The principle he and Colt built together, reliable, repeating firepower in the hand of one man, would define American warfare, American law enforcement, and the American West for the next half-century. Every lawman who ever strapped on a six-shooter owes something to Sam Walker. Every Texas Ranger who rode out after him carried a weapon shaped by his blood in his mind. He did not live to see what he had started. But the Rangers he left behind were about to ride into something even he could not have imagined. The year was 1846, and America was about to go to war. Not a border skirmish. Not a cattle raid. A full war between two nations. And the Texas Rangers were going to be right in the middle of it. When President James K. Polk called for volunteers, the Rangers didn't wait long. They showed up at General Zachary Taylor's camp along the Rio Grande, rough men, armed to the teeth, riding horses that looked like they'd been born in a drought. Taylor had never seen soldiers quite like them. They didn't march in formation. They didn't wear uniforms. And they did not follow orders the way regular soldiers did. But they could scout. They could track a man across 60 miles of dry rock and find him before sundown. That skill was worth more to Taylor than 100 drilled infantrymen. He used them as his eyes. And in the summer of 1846, those eyes led American forces deep into Mexican territory. Here's where the story gets complicated. The Rangers were effective. Brutally, undeniably effective. But effective and controlled are two very different things. Mexican civilians began calling them Los Diablos Tejano, the Texas Devils. That name was not a compliment. The Rangers carried with them something that went beyond military orders, a personal history of violence with Mexico that stretched back years. Many of them had watched friends die at the Alamo. Many had buried family members after raids along the Nueces River. For them, this war was not just policy. It was personal. And personal vengeance in wartime is one of the most dangerous things on earth. At Monterrey, in September 1846, the Rangers fought street by street through a fortified Mexican city. It was brutal close-quarters fighting, nothing like open-field cavalry charges. Rangers knocked holes through walls with picks and crowbars to avoid the open streets. They moved like water through the city, fast and relentless. Monterrey fell. But after the battle, reports began to surface. Looting. Killings of civilians. Scores settled that had nothing to do with the battle itself. General Taylor was furious. He wrote to Washington calling the Rangers, his own scouts, licentious vandals. He said they could not be controlled. That their conduct was doing more damage to America's reputation in Mexico than the battles themselves. And Taylor, who was no soft man, sent several Ranger companies home. Sent them home. Think about that. A general fighting a war discharged his own soldiers because they were too violent. But the war was bigger than one general's patience. General Winfield Scott needed men for his push toward Mexico City. He brought Rangers back. Specifically, he wanted Colonel John Coffee Hayes, the same Jack Hayes who had survived Comanche attacks that should have killed him 10 times over. Hayes brought his men south, and they fought at Veracruz, at Cerro Gordo, all the way up the mountain roads toward the Mexican capital. By the time American forces entered Mexico City in September 1847, the Rangers had earned a reputation that spread across two countries. Feared by enemies. Admired by allies. Condemned by diplomats. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war in February 1848. The United States gained over 500,000 square miles of territory: California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado. Texas had its border officially recognized at the Rio Grande. The Rangers had fought to make that line real. But a line on a map doesn't make a border peaceful. The land was still raw. The resentments on both sides ran deep. And now the Rangers were expected to police 1,000 miles of it with a handful of men, no federal budget, and enemies on every side. One of those enemies was about to become the most wanted man in the entire state of Texas. After the Mexican War, Texas didn't calm down. It exploded. The Rangers had fought armies, but now they faced something harder to pin down: outlaws, bandits, and chaos spreading across a state the size of a small country. By 1850, Texas had roughly 200,000 people, and most of them lived far from any courthouse, any sheriff, any law at all. Out on the edges, the only law that existed was the law a man carried on his hip. And into that vacuum rode some of the most dangerous men the American West ever produced. Here's the thing about Texas in those years: the Rangers weren't a standing army anymore. They were constantly being formed, disbanded, reformed, depending on who was governor and how much money the state had, which was usually not much. So for long stretches, there were almost no Rangers at all. And the outlaws knew it. John Wesley Hardin knew it better than anyone. By the time he was 17 years old, Hardin had already killed multiple men. He was born in 1853, the son of a Methodist preacher, which tells you that the frontier had a way of making its own rules regardless of what your father believed. Hardin claimed to have killed over 40 men by the end of his life, and while that number is disputed, nobody disputes that he was terrifyingly fast with a gun. He once shot a man through a hotel wall because the man was snoring too loud. That's the kind of detail that sounds made up, but it's not. The Rangers wanted Hardin badly. He had killed a Texas state policeman in 1871, a direct challenge to everything the Rangers stood for. For years, he slipped through their fingers, moving from county to county, changing his name. Running cattle, fighting, killing. Meanwhile, he wasn't alone. The Texas frontier in the 1870s was practically a highway for fugitives. Men fleeing Reconstruction and the South poured into Texas, where the federal government's reach was thin and justice was slow. Bank robbers, cattle thieves, murderers, they all looked at Texas and saw opportunity. And the cattle industry made it worse. After the Civil War, Texas was overrun with feral longhorn cattle, millions of them, just roaming free. Whoever could round them up and drive them north could sell them for 10 times what they were worth in Texas. It was fast money. And fast money drew fast men. Cattle rustling became almost a profession. Gangs would steal hundreds of head at a time, rebrand them, and move them across state lines before anyone noticed. The Rangers were stretched impossibly thin trying to cover it all. In 1874, the state finally gave them real power again. Governor Richard Koch reorganized the force into 2 battalions, the Frontier Battalion and the Special Force. The Frontier Battalion would handle the western edge of the state: Comanche raids, bandits, open country. The Special Force, under a captain named Leander McNelly, would handle the southern border. McNelly was a small man, soft-spoken, dying of tuberculosis even as he led his men. But he was one of the most relentless lawmen Texas ever produced. And the Frontier Battalion had its own mission, hunting men like John Wesley Hardin. In July 1877, a ranger named John Armstrong tracked Hardin all the way to Pensacola, Florida. Hardin was on a train when Armstrong walked down the aisle and put a gun in his face. Hardin went for his weapon, got it tangled in his suspenders, and Armstrong pistol-whipped him unconscious. John Wesley Hardin was finally under arrest. He was brought back to Texas, tried, and sentenced to 25 years in Huntsville prison. The Rangers had done what years of lawmen across 2 states couldn't do. But catching one outlaw, even the most feared outlaw in Texas, barely made a dent. Because while Hardin sat in a prison cell, the border was burning. And McNelly's Special Force was about to do something so bold, so reckless, so completely unauthorized, that it nearly started a second war with Mexico. The year was 1861, and everything the Rangers had built was about to be torn apart. Texas voted to leave the Union on February 1st, and that single decision cracked the Rangers down the middle. Some Rangers stayed loyal to the United States. Others put on gray and marched south to fight for the Confederacy. The force that had held the frontier together for nearly 3 decades simply stopped existing. And the frontier felt it immediately. With the Rangers gone, Comanche and Kiowa raiding parties swept back across the Edwards Plateau like a wave that had been waiting. Towns that had felt safe for years woke up to smoke on the horizon. Cattle were taken. Farms were abandoned. Families fled east. The state of Texas knew it had a problem, and in early 1861 it scrambled to replace the Rangers with anything. They created what they called the Frontier Regiment. 11 companies of men stretched across a thin line of forts running from the Red River down to the Rio Grande. It sounded impressive on paper. In reality, it was a skeleton crew guarding 600 miles of open country. Each man was responsible for patrolling an average of 50 miles of terrain. 50 miles. On horseback. Through rattlesnake country. With no backup. But Comanche knew exactly what was happening. They tested the line, probed it, and when they found the gaps, and there were always gaps, they poured through. The Nueces Strip, that wild stretch between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, became something close to a war zone all its own. Confederate Texas also faced a threat from within. In the Texas Hill Country, German immigrant communities had largely opposed secession. Many of them refused to take up arms for the Confederacy. In August of 1862, a group of about 65 of these Unionist men tried to slip south toward Mexico to avoid conscription. Confederate forces caught them at the Nueces River. In the fight and the execution of survivors that followed, at least 34 men were killed. It became known as the Nueces Massacre, and it is one of the darkest moments in Texas Civil War history. Meanwhile, the Confederate government in Richmond had its own plans for Texas men, none of which involved protecting Texas. They pulled troops east. They needed soldiers for Virginia, for Tennessee, for Georgia. Texas bled its young men into a war fought 1,000 miles away. By 1863, some frontier counties had lost so many men that barely anyone was left to work the farms or fight the raids. Women and children in isolated homesteads were left to defend themselves. There are accounts, documented, real, of mothers keeping loaded rifles beside the fireplace every single night. The state tried again in 1863, reorganizing the frontier defense into what they called the Frontier Organization, essentially a local militia system. It was better than nothing. Just barely. Then in April 1865, it all collapsed anyway. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the Confederacy dissolved, and Texas found itself occupied by federal troops who had no particular interest in chasing Comanche raiders across the Llano Estacado. The frontier was as exposed as it had ever been. The Rangers existed in name, only a ghost of what they had been. It would take a new Texas, a new era, and one extraordinary man to bring them back. The Civil War had gutted the Rangers, but Texas wasn't done bleeding. When the war ended in 1865, the frontier was a wreck. Comanche and Kiowa raiders had pushed the line of settlement back, sometimes 50 miles east. Farms were abandoned, families were dead or fled, and the land between the settlements and the Buffalo Plains belonged to nobody safe. The U.S. Army sent troops, the famous Buffalo Soldiers among them, to hold the frontier forts. But the Army moved slow, worked in formations, and rarely caught anyone. The Rangers were the ones who knew how to chase. So in 1874, the Texas legislature did something decisive. They created the Frontier Battalion, 6 companies, up to 75 men each, armed and funded properly for the first time in years. Major John B. Jones was put in command, and he was exactly the right man for the job. Jones was lean, methodical, and relentless, a Confederate veteran who'd traded plantation life for a life in the saddle. He set up a chain of ranger camps stretching from the Red River in the north all the way down to the Rio Grande. Each camp was a rough thing, canvas tents, hard ground, bad coffee, and men who slept with their boots on. The idea was simple: if the raiders struck anywhere along the line, the nearest camp would ride hard and cut them off. It worked, not perfectly, but better than anything Texas had tried before. And the Rangers needed every advantage they could get, because 1874 was about to get violent. That summer, a young Comanche war leader named Quanah Parker led a massive raid into the Texas Panhandle. He was the son of a Comanche chief and a captured white woman named Cynthia Ann Parker, a story Texas already knew and feared. Quanah had united Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne warriors, hundreds of them, for one coordinated strike. Their target was Adobe Walls, a small trading post deep in the Panhandle. The Battle of Adobe Walls was not a ranger fight, it was buffalo hunters with long rifles who held the post against the attack. But it lit the fuse on what history would call the Red River War. The U.S. Army launched a massive campaign, converging on the Comanche heartland from 5 directions at once. The Rangers weren't the tip of that spear, but they were on the edges, cutting off escape routes and running down stragglers. The decisive blow came in September 1874, at Palo Duro Canyon, a stunning gash in the Panhandle that most Texans didn't even know existed. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie led the Army cavalry down into the canyon and found the winter camp of the Comanche, their horses, their food stores, their teepees, everything they needed to survive. Mackenzie didn't massacre the people, but he destroyed everything else, and then he shot over 1,000 horses. Without horses, the Comanche couldn't hunt, couldn't fight, couldn't run. By the spring of 1875, Quanah Parker led his people onto the reservation at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The southern plains were broken, and the frontier the Rangers had been fighting to hold for 40 years finally started to close. But closing the frontier didn't mean the violence stopped. It just changed shape. Cattle thieves, outlaw gangs, feuding families, and men running from the law poured into the vacuum that the Indian Wars had left behind. The Frontier Battalion, still under Jones, pivoted fast. They started hunting a different kind of enemy, men with names, with grudges, with hideouts in the hill country and the brush south of San Antonio. Rangers rode into towns where the local sheriff wouldn't dare go, posted themselves in saloons, and waited. Sometimes the arrest was clean. Sometimes it wasn't. In 1877, Jones personally rode into the town of El Paso, then one of the most dangerous places in North America, to break up a violent feud that had already left bodies in the street. He brought a handful of Rangers and sheer nerve, and it held. The Frontier Battalion was becoming something new, less a militia, more a professional force. Men who could fight a war one year and serve a warrant the next. But just as the Rangers were finding their stride as lawmen, a new threat was rising along the southern border, and it would test them in ways the frontier never had. By the 1930s, the Texas Rangers had survived wars, outlaws, and their own near abolition. But nothing in their century-long history had quite prepared them for Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was a waitress from Rowena, Texas, barely 5 feet tall, sharp-tongued, and bored out of her mind. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was a small-time thief from West Dallas who had already done hard time at the brutal Eastham prison farm. They met in January 1930, and within weeks, Clyde was arrested and Bonnie smuggled a gun into his jail cell. That was the beginning. Over the next 4 years, the Barrow gang tore across the American Southwest like a fever dream. They robbed small-town banks and filling stations, not because they got rich, they rarely did, but because Clyde seemed to need the chaos. They killed at least 13 people, including 9 law enforcement officers. Small towns along the Texas-Oklahoma border locked their doors when rumors spread that the Barrow gang was nearby. The newspapers made them famous, maybe too famous. Photos of Bonnie posing with a cigar and a shotgun ran on front pages across the country. The depression-weary public had a complicated love affair with them, 2 kids from the dirt-poor South sticking it to the system. But here is what the newspapers left out: the real Bonnie and Clyde were not glamorous. They slept in stolen cars, ate cold food, and changed hideouts every few days. Clyde's legs had been permanently scarred from a steam pipe at Eastham. He cut off 2 of his own toes to escape the work detail. And the law was closing in. Enter Frank Hamer. Hamer was 50 years old in 1934, a former Texas Ranger captain who had already survived 52 gunfights and been shot 17 times. He was not a romantic figure, he was methodical, patient, and utterly relentless. Texas Governor Miriam Ma Ferguson had actually disbanded much of the Ranger force in 1933, viewing them as political enemies. So the state prison system hired Hamer privately, pulled him out of retirement, and gave him one job: find Bonnie and Clyde. Hamer spent 102 days tracking them. He studied their patterns, their routes, their loyalties. He even drove the same roads they drove. He learned that Clyde always moved in a rough triangle between Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and that he always returned to family. That instinct for family would be their undoing. Hamer got a tip through Henry Methvin, a gang member whose own father was now cooperating with authorities in Louisiana. Iverson Methvin, Henry's father, agreed to help set a trap on a rural road near Sales, Louisiana, Bienville Parish. On the morning of May 23, 1934, 6 lawmen, including Hamer and Dallas County Deputy Ted Hinton, hid in the brush along Highway 154. They waited for hours in the pine woods, silent, still, breathing slowly. At 9:15 in the morning, a tan Ford the 5.8 came rolling down the road. Clyde was behind the wheel, driving in his socks the way he always did. Iverson Methvin's truck was parked on the side of the road, staged to slow them down. Clyde slowed. That was the last thing he ever did. The 6 lawmen opened fire simultaneously, more than 130 rounds in under 10 seconds. The Ford lurched off the road into a ditch, riddled with bullet holes. Bonnie Parker was 23 years old. Clyde Barrow was 25. Frank Hamer walked to the car, looked inside, and reportedly said nothing at all. The death car was hauled to the nearby town of Arcadia, Louisiana, and crowds lined the streets to see it. People reached through the windows to pull out souvenirs: a lock of Bonnie's hair, a piece of Clyde's bloody shirt. It was grotesque, and it was very American. The killings reignited a national debate: had it been justice or an execution? Hamer never apologized. He said he gave them the same chance they had given their victims. But the story of the Texas Rangers was far from finished, because the greatest test of what they stood for was still coming. One riot, one ranger. It's the most famous thing anyone ever said about the Texas Rangers. And like most famous things, it's part true, part myth, and part something the Rangers themselves were very happy to let people believe. Here's what actually happened. The year was 1896. The city of Dallas had scheduled a prize fight, a boxing match that the state government had declared illegal. The governor wanted it stopped. So he sent one ranger. Captain Bill McDonald stepped off the train, looked at the crowd of thousands waiting for that fight, and the city marshal met him with a question. "Where are the others?" the marshal asked. McDonald looked him dead in the eye and said, "Hell, ain't I enough? There's only one riot." The fight was called off that day. One man. One riot. One ranger. It's a perfect story. Almost too perfect. Because the Rangers knew something that every great institution eventually learns, that the story you tell about yourself matters just as much as what you actually do. And by 1896, the Rangers had been telling their story for over 70 years. They started as a ragged militia on a lawless frontier, barely paid, barely equipped. Stephen F. Austin organized the first company in 1823, 30 men to protect settlers from raid and ambush. No uniforms. No badges. No rules of engagement beyond survival. They fought the Comanche across open plains where the land itself could kill you. They absorbed the Walker Colt revolver and changed the balance of power on the frontier forever. They rode into Mexico with Zachary Taylor and proved themselves in a war that transformed the continent. They hunted outlaws across a state larger than most countries. They survived the Civil War, the occupation, the poverty, the politics. And somewhere in all of that, through the blood and the dust and the bad decisions, they became something larger than themselves. They became a symbol. But symbols carry weight. And the Rangers carried some very dark weight alongside their legend. The same force that protected settlers on the frontier also terrorized Mexican-American families along the Rio Grande. In the years between 1910 and 1920, during the violence that spilled north from the Mexican Revolution, Rangers killed hundreds of Tejano, some guilty of crimes, many completely innocent. The Porvenir Massacre of 1918 were Rangers and ranchers. executed 15 unarmed Mexican men and boys in a remote West Texas village, was not an aberration. It was a pattern. For decades the state refused to fully reckon with it. The names of the dead were not in the Ranger Museum. The stories were not told on school trips. But history has a way of surfacing what institutions try to bury. In recent years, researchers and descendants have pushed back, demanding that the full record be part of the full story. And slowly, painfully, it is. Because that is the honest thing about the Texas Rangers, they are not one story. They are dozens of stories running alongside each other, sometimes in direct contradiction. The ranger who tracked a killer for 300 miles through the brush. The ranger who crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The ranger who showed up alone and stopped a riot with a look. The ranger who made a family disappear and called it justice. All of it is true. All of it is the Rangers. Today the force still exists, about 150 active Rangers, working cold cases, major crimes, public corruption. They carry laptops now instead of Winchesters. But they still wear that silver star cut from a Mexican silver peso, the same design going back to the 1840s. And when you hold one of those badges, you are holding every version of that story at once. The legend. The violence. The courage. The shame. The men who deserved the star and the men who didn't. The frontier is long gone. But the question the Rangers have always forced on this country is still very much alive: what does it mean to keep order on a land that was never really yours to begin with?